first complaint came on a Tuesday night in March. Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez, a traveling nurse from Phoenix, stood at the front desk of the Cecil Hotel at 3:47 a.m., her hands shaking as she clutched her bathrobe around her thin frame. The night clerk, Marcus, had seen plenty of strange things during his late shifts at the infamous downtown Los Angeles Hotel, but the look in Mrs. Vasquez's eyes was different. It wasn't just fear, it was the deep, bone-chilling terror of someone who had witnessed something that challenged everything they believed about the world. "The elevator," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the ancient air conditioning system. "It stopped on 14. The doors opened, but there was nothing there. Just darkness. Complete darkness. And I heard them." Marcus leaned forward, his pen hovering over the incident report. "Heard what, ma'am?" "Voices," she said, her eyes distant and glassy. "Whispers. Like people were talking, but I couldn't make out the words. And footsteps. Soft footsteps, like someone walking on carpet, but there was no light. Nothing. Just black." The Cecil Hotel had been home to tragedy for decades. Built in the 1920s during Los Angeles' boom years, it had once been a symbol of elegance and prosperity. But as the city changed, so did the hotel. Located in the heart of Skid Row, it became a refuge for the desperate, the forgotten, and the lost. Over the years, the Cecil had earned a reputation that stretched far beyond its faded Art Deco walls. It was a place where people came to disappear, and sometimes, they never left. The 14th floor had been partially sealed for 3 years. Hotel management made the decision after a series of incidents that even the most experienced staff couldn't explain. Room 1408 was where Thomas Chin, a software engineer from San Francisco, had been found dead in his bathtub, his body positioned in a way that suggested he had been trying to escape something. The coroner ruled it a heart attack, but Thomas was only 32 years old with no history of heart problems. His final text message to his wife, sent at 3:17 a.m., read simply, "They're here." 2 doors down, room 1412 had been the scene of Sarah Morrison's death. The young art student from Portland had checked in for what was supposed to be a 3-day stay while visiting galleries in the arts district. She was found hanging from the bathroom door, but what disturbed investigators was the fact that she had barricaded herself inside the room. Furniture was piled against the door, the windows were sealed with tape, and she had written the same phrase over and over on the bathroom mirror in lipstick, "Make them stop talking." The deaths continued over 18 months. An elderly man named Robert Fitz collapsed in the hallway outside room 1405, clutching his chest and gasping about the woman in white who wouldn't stop following him. A young couple from Denver was found dead in room 1420, both apparently having jumped from their window, though the window was only cracked open and there were no signs of struggle. The final incident involved Maria Santos, a hotel housekeeper who had worked at the Cecil for 15 years. She was discovered in a supply closet on the 14th floor, catatonic, her hair turned completely white overnight. She never spoke again, spending her remaining days in a care facility, staring at the wall and occasionally whispering numbers, 14. 14, they're on 14. After Maria's breakdown, hotel management made the decision to seal most of the 14th floor. They kept a few rooms open for storage and maintenance, but guests were no longer assigned to that level. The elevator was programmed to skip the floor entirely. Yet somehow, it kept stopping there. Mrs. Vasquez was not the first guest to report the elevator's midnight visits to the 14th floor, but she was the first to file a formal complaint. Over the following weeks, more reports trickled in. A businessman from Chicago described feeling pulled toward the elevator at 3:15 a.m., as if something was calling him. When the doors opened on 14, he saw what he swore was a woman in a white nightgown standing at the far end of the hallway, beckoning to him. The doors closed before he could get a better look. A young couple on their honeymoon reported that the elevator took them to the 14th floor despite pressing the button for the lobby. When the doors opened, they heard what sounded like a party, muffled music, laughter, and conversation coming from behind the sealed doors. But when they looked closer, they realized the sounds were wrong. The laughter was too high-pitched, the music was distorted, and the voices seemed to be speaking in reverse. Marcus began keeping detailed notes of every incident. The pattern was always the same. Between 3 o'clock and 4 a.m., the elevator would make unauthorized stops at the 14th floor. The doors would open to reveal the darkened hallway, and guests would report hearing, seeing, or feeling things that couldn't be explained. Some described whispers that seemed to come from inside their own heads. Others talked about feeling watched by invisible eyes. A few claimed to see shadowy figures moving in the darkness beyond the elevator doors. The hotel's maintenance supervisor, Jimmy Rodriguez, had worked at the Cecil for over 20 years. He had installed the new elevator system 5 years earlier, and he knew every wire, every circuit, and every mechanical component. When the complaints started piling up, he spent 3 nights monitoring the elevator's electrical systems. What he found defied everything he knew about how elevators worked. The elevator's getting a call signal, Jimmy explained to the hotel manager, David Park, as they stood in the mechanical room reviewing printouts of the elevator's activity logs. Every night, at exactly 3:17 a.m., the system receives a call from the 14th floor. But that's impossible. We removed all the call buttons on that floor when we sealed it. There's no way for anyone to call the elevator from up there. David studied the logs, his brow furrowed with concern. The hotel's reputation was already fragile, and these incidents were starting to affect bookings. Could it be some kind of electrical interference? Maybe something from outside the building? Jimmy shook his head. I've checked everything. The wiring, the control systems, even brought in an outside contractor to do a full diagnostic. The elevator is functioning perfectly. But every night, it responds to a call that shouldn't exist. They decided to install security cameras in the elevator and aimed one down the 14th floor hallway. The footage from the first night was unsettling. At 3:17 a.m., the elevator doors opened to reveal the dark hallway, just as guests had described. But the audio picked up something the human ear had missed during the brief moments when the doors were open. There were sounds, faint but unmistakable, coming from the sealed section of the floor. Footsteps, voices, and what sounded like doors opening and closing. The second night's footage was worse. The elevator doors opened at the usual time, but this time, the camera caught movement in the darkness. Something, or someone, was standing at the far end of the hallway, just beyond the reach of the emergency lighting. It was difficult to make out details, but the figure appeared to be gesturing, as if beckoning the elevator forward. By the third night, Jimmy refused to review the footage alone. He brought David and Marcus to the security office, and together they watched the timestamp tick toward 3:17 a.m. When the elevator doors opened, all 3 men saw it clearly, a woman in a white nightgown standing in the hallway, her face pale and eyes hollow. She raised her hand and waved, a slow, deliberate gesture that sent chills down their spines. Behind her, other figures began to emerge from the darkness, shadowy forms that seemed to drift rather than walk. Jesus Christ, Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. How many of them are there? The figures continued to appear until the hallway seemed filled with ghostly forms, all of them facing the elevator, all of them waving. The doors closed after their programmed 30-second delay, but the 3 men continued to stare at the monitor, none of them speaking. Word of the footage spread quickly among the staff. Some refused to work night shifts. Others demanded transfers to different departments. The few who remained began to notice other changes in the hotel. Guests reported cold spots in their rooms, particularly on floors directly above and below the 14th. The hotel's landline phone system began receiving calls from extensions that had been disconnected years ago, extensions that had belonged to rooms where people had died. Dr. Rebecca Matthews, a paranormal investigator from UCLA, heard about the Cecil Hotel incidents through a colleague who had connections with the LAPD. She had spent 15 years studying unexplained phenomena, and the reports from the Cecil fit a pattern she had encountered before. Places of intense emotional trauma, she believed, could sometimes retain impressions of the events that occurred there, like a recording that played back under certain conditions. The 14th floor has experienced multiple traumatic deaths in a relatively short period, Dr. Matthews explained to David Park during their initial meeting. In my research, I found that when several people die in emotional distress within the same location, it can create what I call a resonance effect. The emotional energy of those final moments becomes trapped, and under the right conditions, it can manifest in ways that affect the physical world. David was skeptical but desperate. The hotel was losing guests, and several staff members had quit. He agreed to let Dr. Matthews conduct an investigation, hoping that a scientific explanation might help resolve the situation. Dr. Matthews and her team arrived on a Thursday night in late April. They set up electromagnetic field detectors, thermal imaging cameras, and sensitive audio equipment throughout the 14th floor and in the elevator. Their plan was to monitor the environment during the hours when the phenomena typically occurred and document any anomalies they could measure. At 3:10 a.m., the electromagnetic field detectors began registering unusual spikes. The temperature in the elevator shaft dropped by 15 degrees in less than 2 minutes. The audio equipment picked up frequencies that were just below the range of human hearing, subsonic vibrations that could cause feelings of unease and the sensation of being watched. When the elevator doors opened at 3:17 a.m., Dr. Matthews was inside with her equipment. What she experienced in those 30 seconds would haunt her for the rest of her career. The darkness beyond the doors seemed to move and shift, as if it were alive. The temperature plummeted until her breath became visible in the air. The electromagnetic field detector went wild, its readings spiking far beyond anything she had ever recorded, but it was the voices that affected her most profoundly. Through her headphones, she could hear them clearly, dozens of voices, all speaking at once, all begging for help. She recognized some of the words, "Don't leave us here, help me, it's so cold," and repeatedly, "Make it stop." The voices layered over each other, creating a chorus of desperation and fear that seemed to come from the darkness itself. As the elevator doors began to close, Dr. Matthews saw them, the figures that the security cameras had captured. But seeing them with her own eyes was completely different from watching grainy footage. They were people, she realized. Real people, or the impressions of real people, trapped in their final moments of terror and confusion. The woman in the white nightgown was Sarah Morrison, the art student who had barricaded herself in room 1412. Behind her stood Thomas Chin, still wearing the clothes he had died in. Robert Fitz was there too, clutching his chest, his face twisted in pain and fear. They were all looking at her with desperate eyes, reaching toward the elevator as if it were their only chance of escape. But as the doors closed, Dr. Matthews understood the horrible truth. They weren't trying to escape. They were trying to bring others with them, to share their fate with the living who dared to visit their prison of endless 3 a.m. moments. The investigation concluded that the 14th floor had indeed become a kind of supernatural trap, where the final moments of multiple traumatic deaths had somehow become locked in time. The elevator, responding to some form of energy or signal that science couldn't yet explain, was being called to that floor by the trapped consciousness of those who had died there. Dr. Matthews recommended that the hotel consider more drastic measures, complete renovation of the 14th floor, or even demolition of that section of the building. But the Cecil Hotel's financial situation made such extensive work impossible. Instead, management decided to disconnect the elevator's access to the 14th floor entirely, removing it from the building's electrical system. The modification worked, but only partially. The elevator stopped making its nightly visits to the 14th floor, but guests on the 13th and 15th floors began reporting new disturbances. They heard footsteps in the hallways above and below their rooms, always at 3:17 a.m. Some reported seeing figures in the stairwells, the same figures that had appeared in the 14th floor hallway, now searching for another way to make contact with the living world. Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez, the traveling nurse who had filed the first complaint, returned to Los Angeles 6 months later for work. Despite everything she had experienced, she decided to stay at the Cecil Hotel again, partly out of morbid curiosity and partly because of the low rates. She requested a room on the 8th floor, far from the 14th. On her second night, she was awakened at 3:17 a.m. by the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside her room. Slow, deliberate footsteps that stopped directly outside her door. She held her breath, listening, as someone, or something, tried the door handle. It turned slowly, but the chain lock held. Through the gap in the door, she saw a pale hand reaching through, fingers stretched toward her. She never stayed at the Cecil Hotel again, but she often wondered about the people trapped on the 14th floor. In her prayers each night, she included a request that they might find peace, that they might finally be able to leave the prison of their final moments. Sometimes, she imagined she could hear them, not just at the Cecil Hotel, but wherever she traveled for work. The whispers followed her, soft voices asking for help, begging to be remembered, pleading not to be forgotten in the darkness of their eternal 3 a.m. The Cecil Hotel continued to operate, but the 14th floor remained sealed. New guests occasionally reported strange experiences, elevators that stopped at floors they hadn't selected, whispers in empty hallways, and the persistent feeling of being watched. The hotel's staff learned to acknowledge these reports with patient understanding, offering room changes and sympathetic ears to those who had encountered something beyond explanation. But every night at 3:17 a.m., if you listened carefully in the stairwells or stood near the elevator shaft, you could still hear them. The soft sounds of movement from the sealed 14th floor, the whispers of voices that would never find rest, and the gentle sound of footsteps pacing back and forth in rooms that were supposed to be empty. The elevator might no longer answer their call, but the dead of the 14th floor continued to wait, trapped in their moment of greatest need, forever hoping that someone, someday, might find a way to set them free from their endless night of terror at the Cecil Hotel.